Hey guys, it's me again, just a couple minutes later. I hope you had a chance to think about this question of, where did teenagers come from? And again, just to reiterate, yes, people who are 14, 15, 16 always existed, but we did not have what we think of as the air quotes teenager as a social class until really pretty recently. Um, Maybe 100 years ago or so is about when that idea came about. And if you think about that in the context of history, 100 years ago isn't very long ago. Um, so, what made the difference? Did you think about that? Did you come up with any ideas? Well, here's what I think. The thing that made the invention of the teenager possible is another invention, and that's the car. All right. The car was invented, give or take, in the 1920s. Um, Before that, people were riding around on horseback or in horse drawn carriages or walking everywhere, right? So the car, the invention of the car, changed a lot of things. All right. Now, at first, when the car came along, they were handmade, a piece at a time, and very expensive. And only really wealthy people had their own cars, kind of like airplanes today. Only really wealthy people have their own airplanes. But a guy named Henry Ford came along and figured out a way to make cars pretty cheap so that most people could afford them. And then when most people started having cars, it really changed everything. It not only created the teenager, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, but it also created the idea of suburbs, right? Because before that, people had to live in the city where they worked, right? If you worked for a factory, which would usually be downtown or somewhere on the waterfront or something like that, you had to live near it, right? Because if you had to be at work at 5 in the morning, well, you're not going to walk for 10 miles to get there. You got to walk, a half a mile to get there. So people generally, for the most part, either lived in cities or they lived on farms. And we didn't have this thing that we call suburbs. So the car changed that, right? You could live, 20 miles from your work, but with your car, you could be there in, 10 minutes. So that really changed a lot of things. The So how did the car help us invent the teenager? Well, um, let's take an example. Something like dating, all right? Um, Back when we thought of, there were only kids and there were only adults, a date meant not that you could get in your car and go somewhere. It meant that somebody you were interested in would come over to your house and they would sit on either like your front porch or your parlor, right? And there would be a chaperone there. Usually one of your parents or both of your parents would sit there. So how awkward is that? Your date your date is that you're sitting in a chair, your significant other, the person you're interested in, is sitting on the couch, and like a parent or an aunt or an uncle or a grandfather is sitting in between you, and you're just supposed to sort of have your date while they're sitting there, right? Really awkward. So again, that was sort of treating older kids, old enough to date, like they were little children and needed to be constantly supervised. Once the car was invented, the teenagers then could start borrowing the car to go out on a date. That meant no more adults around. That meant they could go to their own places. That meant they could be alone. They could develop their own society. They could go join with their cars, meet somewhere and join other teenagers. So they started forming their own group. When you form your own group, you form your own language. They started talking like teenagers, right? So it was that freedom that the car allowed that really sort of gave us teenagers. Let them get away from the house, let them get away from mom and dad, and let them sort of form their own group outside of that parental influence and start to be their own independent group. That's what gave us the idea of the teenager. So it's really interesting. You know, again, this is all within the last 100 years. So after that, subsequent to that, you know, car culture became very important for teenagers, especially through the 50s, on into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Now, I have a discussion question for you about sort of the fading away of that kind of car culture. But through all that time, and certainly through my own growing up, you know, cars were a very important part of life. Cars were a very important part of your bond with your friends and so on. And, you know, we had, especially in this country, this sort of car culture. So that's a little background on where we got this idea of teenagers. So, of course, we couldn't have literature and novels for teenagers until we had teenagers, right? So that's where it started. And we'll move on and start talking about sort of the issues and the concerns, the themes that we're going to see in some of these books repeated over and over that are important to teenagers once they were finally invented. All right, so take a look at the discussion question. I'll probably just attach it to this same video thread, and give me an answer. Give me your thoughts. All right. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll move on.